Hey guys, Omerko here, self-taught web developer. In my last video you learned how could you use one-way data binding in Angular, and I told you that there is also a way to use a two-way data binding. Here on my screen I will show you a simple presentation how that looks, and later we will work with the code with it. So here on my screen we have template, our HTML section on the left side, and the TypeScript section, which is our, programming code on the right side. Here what we could see, on our HTML we usually hold some rendered data, and that rendered data, usually we have a property for that. So as you saw in my last video, we had the property of username, and we binded that to our HTML heading, and we were able to see that username in a heading of our HTML. Here we can see that. So from the property of our TypeScript, we were able to bind the data to our HTML element and render that data. And this is called one-way data binding, because it is binding from TypeScript only to HTML way. To add a two-way data binding, we use something called NgModel. Here on this example, you can see that here on the HTML side we have our input field. With that NgModel, we are binding input field to our property, and that same property we could bind later to our rendered data. We don't need to do that. We could bind NgModel to some property and use that property, send that data from that NgModel to our, let's say, post route, a request that we could have, or we could bring that property back with NgModel again and render that data. To show you now how that will look on my screen, I will first remove this image and input field here, and we have just username here, which is bind to the username property that we have. Let me also remove this image path that we added in our last video. Our page will look something like this. We have Jane Doe here, and that's it. This Jane Doe is binding from our property to our HTML. As I already mentioned, we will use something called NgModel for this. So here above my heading, I will put the input, and this input should be the type of text, and to this input we could pass something called NgModel. To add the NgModel, we shouldn't add it like this. First of all, we will use these braces here and our normal ones, and now we can add NgModel inside. Here we should set the value, and this value should be set to something that we could have on our property. So for that, as I already have, I could use user name here. Now checking my browser, we could see the clear error. Can't bind NgModel since it isn't a known property of input. And down here we could see the input error here, NgModel and username. We could see this curly underline below. So what does this mean? Well, as this NgModel doesn't exist, obviously it isn't, because it is not known to our input field. We should import it from somewhere. To do that, we are going into our app module TypeScript. Here we handle our imports, declarations for our components, modules, etc. As the NgModel belongs to the forms module, it belongs to the forms of the Angular, we should import that module. So here below my browser module, which is by the way the important module for our Angular, here we will add forms module like this. Importing this form module, it will automatically import for me here at the top from Angular/forms. Now saving this, my NgModel should work now. Checking my browser, we could see that we have Jane Doe in our input field as a value, and also Jane Doe in our heading as a value. So now this value, this property is bind into two ways, even though it looks it is bind into just one way. So to show you that, I could change this value here in the Jane Doe input field, change it, and you can see that the value will also change in my heading. So this means that this input field is binded, the value of the input field with NgModel is binded to our property in our TypeScript file that we have, our username property. And as it is binded through NgModel, it will modify the property by changing the data on this input field, as I now did. And changing the data of this input field will also change the property, which means that the value of the username holds now JND, and here we could also see that JND in our input field. So this is the way how two-way data binding works. And here we could see that clear example. We had the input field here on our HTML. We used the NgModel on our input field. With that, we passed some data to our property, which was the username property, and this property holded some data even before. Now, with this NgModel, it was modified, and that same property brought back the rendered data to our heading, which was the modified data that we had on that property. And this is how the two-way data binding works in the Angular itself. For the next week, you could expect 2 more videos from me. One of those will be attribute bindings, which you already looked even before, but you will now see how could we use different bindings for the different attributes. And also, we will take a look into references in our templates. So I will show you also that. Those are also called local references. But this will be all for this video. Thank you all for watching. If you like what you saw, please click like and subscribe, as I'm posting new content weekly. Thank you once again, and I will see you in my next video. Bye bye.